Thank you. Gracias. Bienvenidos a esta noche en honor a Joel Meyerowitz. Terminamos una semana dedicada al flamenco en relación a la exposición Europa 1966-67 de Joel Meyerowitz, que recorre su estancia durante todo un año por el continente europeo y que tuvo de capitalidad la ciudad de Málaga. Es para nosotros un honor estar aquí en el Museo de Málaga. Queremos agradecer en primer lugar a María Morente, la directora del museo, que nos haya cedido este espacio tan magnífico para tener una masterclass de Joel. Quiero agradecer la presencia del alcalde, la presencia de Bernard Ruiz Picasso entre nosotros, miembros del comité, miembros del patronato, y muy felices de teneros hoy aquí. La exposición es un metaviaje. Hemos hablado alguna vez de que supone un viaje sobre un viaje de Joel, y supone también adentrarnos en la experiencia de por qué razón, dentro de ese año de viaje por Europa, la mitad se produjo aquí, en Málaga. Y la razón tiene que ver con el flamenco, tiene que ver con el misterio del flamenco, el misterio de esta ciudad, la luz de esta ciudad. Él nos hablará ahora durante su conferencia de las claves estéticas que él detectó aquí con 28 años. Y es un honor volver a tenerte aquí en la ciudad y volver a recibirte, 60 años casi después, y recibirte con tanto cariño, recibirte con toda esta pasión. Este lema que tenemos en el museo de que el artista está en el centro, Picasso está en el centro y has compartido ese centro del museo. El artista, el alma del artista, el alma creativa con nosotros. Y queremos darte las gracias por toda tu pasión, toda tu involucración y todo tu trabajo para hacer la exposición, lo que podemos ver en el museo. Después de la masterclass de Joel tendremos una actuación de la Lupi. Pensamos cuando diseñamos la semana del flamenco por Joel Meyerowitz que teníamos que tener un momento en el cual se fundiera la fotografía de Joel con el flamenco. Y pensamos con Lourdes Gálvez Postigo que el personaje ideal era la Lupi. Así que justo después de tu masterclass podremos tener la oportunidad de ver cómo responde la Lupi a la masterclass y a la fotografía de Joel. Y mañana quiero también recordarles que hay una actuación de Carmen Linares en la Alcazabilla, en la calle Alcazabilla, a las 9:30 de la noche, acceso libre y gratuito, y estamos también muy contentos de poder terminar la semana de flamenco por Joel Meyerowitz también con esta celebración con Carmen Linares. Darte las gracias de nuevo, Joel, por tu participación, y quiero invitarte al escenario con un grandísimo aplauso. Thank you.
Again.
Thank you so much. So the stage is yours. Thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you. Wow. Buenas tardes todos. No puedo hablar en español. Muchos años han pasado aquí en Málaga. Parlavo in questo periodo? Sì. Ora, nada. So, English it is. I hope all of you either will understand it or have the headphones. The first thing I have to say is thank you to the Picasso Museum and to the Málaga Museum for allowing us to be here tonight and for the exhibition. Thank you, Bernard. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you to the museum. Miguel, thank you for your friendship and for the wonderful experiences we've had together before this show, but since you've taken over the directorship of the museum, you've really engaged with this work in a way that I feel I've learned a lot from revisiting it with you. And I have to also pay grace to my wife, Maggie Barrett, right here, because, yes, Maggie. Because when I made this trip, when I was 28 years old and spent a year in Europe and 6 months, as Miguel said, here in Málaga, I was married at the time, but it was a young marriage, and it struggled. And over the years, I had wished any number of times that I was here with a woman who loved me and who I loved. And so this exhibition is a full circle. I've been able to come back 58 years later with the woman I love, who can really feel what it was like for me all these years, because I've told her about Málaga and the Escalona family and the discovery, the self-discovery that happened here. And I'm sure this is true for many of you. There's a time in your life when something happens and you pass through a changing place in your life. It's as if you suddenly wake up or you grow up. And for me, that year in Europe, in 1966 and 67, was a chance to be basically on my own in the world, trying to develop my own ideas. And you know, there's a responsibility. If you call yourself an artist, you have to be genuine and have to make something that comes through you and out into the world. Part of that is a tribute to the history of art. And I want to say thank you to the Picasso Museum of Málaga, because Pablo Picasso was a huge and important figure in my life as a young artist. Before I was a photographer, I was a painter. And studying Picasso's work and trying to understand the range of it, probably more than anything else, what I really learned from Picasso was that you can be many selves, that there are many versions of you inside of yourself, and as you age, you have a chance to discover them. What I'd like to show you tonight is as Miguel calls it, the meta journey, the journey that I took when I began photography in 1962. I was 24 years old. I was working in a small advertising agency in New York, and I designed a booklet. My boss gave the booklet to a photographer named Robert Frank, a really legendary photographer now. And watching Robert Frank work changed my life. At that moment, I decided I would quit my job, I would get a camera, and I would go into the street, and the world would teach me whatever it is I could learn. So, even though it's very bright, this is a very beautiful screen, and we'll begin the show. Okay, so this is the theoretical completó, Maggie. Thank you. So in 1962, when I quit that job, I went to a camera store and I bought 2 rolls of film. And the guy said to me, "What do you want, color or black and white?" And I said, "Color," because the world is in color. I didn't know at the time that the establishment, the art establishment, thought that black and white was what photography should be. I felt, how crazy is that? The world is in color. And so I started out by working on the streets of New York. And the first fascination I had was with women, strong women. I think because I was a young man at 24, I didn't really understand women. And I thought by making photographs, I might learn something about who women are, what they mean to me, how can I photograph them, what kind of attention or tribute can I pay. At that very moment, in '62, I started going to the parades. In New York City, in the summertime, there's a parade almost every weekend. And it's a way of being disguised so that you're not visible, somehow merging in with the crowd, learning how to disappear, how not to disturb the actions that are happening. That was part of the skills to be a street photographer, a kind of invisibility, and to see how close you could get to somebody without them saying, "No, don't take my photograph." So it was an interesting challenge, and I learned a lot from it. For example, this is a picture that often people ask, what's going on there? Because they see a man with his hat over his heart, and they see a black man with a big dog and a white guy, and they have this kind of slight confrontation. And for me, the ambiguity of this interaction, that there's a picture of it, we clearly can see what's there, but we don't really understand what the resolution is, what it's all about. I think that's a particularly special quality of photography, describing things precisely, but leaving a kind of open-ended story. While I was learning to get close to people, I was also trying to shift my energy away from things in the center of the frame. But that's a story that goes back and forth throughout every artist's work. Sometimes the thing just lands in the center. But you'll see as we go through this journey of mine that there were some challenges that I think were really interesting. At the end of that first year, I realized that I needed prints. I needed to hold paper prints in my hand and look through 100 of them at a time. That projecting things on a screen wasn't the best way of showing things. It almost too often became an entertainment. And I would rather have people have a connection to the work, like a text or like poetry. So I began to shoot black and white alongside of color so that I could make these prints. In that first year, I made this photograph. I mean, really, when you look at it, it's a big, hairy guy behind a fence on which sunlight is casting shadows. It looks like it's nothing. But the director of the Museum of Modern Art saw this picture and said, "Ooh, I want to put this in my first show that I'm making at the museum." So there I was, only photographing for a year, and this kind of ambiguous photograph has a chance to go out into the world for the first time. This is typical New York life. Kill your baby sister, kiss me stupid. This is pure luck on New Year's Eve that a movie was playing in New York in Times Square, and at the stroke of midnight, everybody was kissing, and they kissed right there, just where I happened to be. The luck of the photographer. Sometimes things are just absurd. They make no sense whatsoever, but somehow they make a photographic sense. Why should he walk when he can be carried? So in 1966, I earned some money doing an advertising job, and I decided I want to go away to Europe. I've been dreaming of this all of my life. And so I bought 2 tickets on the SS France, which sailed from New York to Southampton, England, and my journey began. And this is the map of the journey, landing in Southampton first, and then traveling down through the south of England to Cornwall and Wales, and then over to Ireland, and over up to Scotland, and back down through England, over to France, all the way through France, down through Spain, and landing in Málaga. And it just happened that in that first week that I was in London, my old boss from the advertising agency was living there. He was also living in Mijas, where he bought a church in the town, and he was rebuilding it himself to be his studio and his home. When I met him in London, he introduced me to a man named Paul Hecht, Pablo Hecht, who was living in Málaga and writing a book on flamenco. He was translating all of the coplas into English so that this poetry of flamenco, which was handed down by song, would now have a kind of clarification in a book. And Pablo said, if you ever get to Malaga, look me up. I'll be at the Bar Guarola, and I'll take you around. So sure enough, we landed in Malaga after almost 3 months on the road, and went looking for Pablo, and found him. And he said, come with me. No, wait a second. Let me show you a little bit of England first so I can get to the picture of Pablo. So in England, it was both familiar and at the same time odd. And I picked up a car in London, which I drove all over Europe, and I began to make photographs from the car while I was driving. Now this may sound like a crazy game to you, but it really made sense to me. And because there are things you see when you're in a car that if you stopped and went back, they wouldn't be there any longer. So they exist in the moment. Like this dragon over a castle in England. Only the English would picnic in a hole on the side of the road where they're tilted over this way. And they're having a great time. It's so uncomfortable. At the same time as I was photographing from a car, I was also trying to prove to the establishment in New York, the art establishment, that color was a serious part of the medium. And I did that by trying to make comparison photographs. I carried 2 cameras, like that one. And if I could make 2 pictures nearly the same, I did, so that I could prove to myself, why color? What does black and white do that color doesn't do? Which is the better art form for me? So you'll see throughout this show some pictures that are pairs like that. From Wales, I went to Ireland, and it was magical. It was a huge difference between my experience in England and Ireland, a kind of open-heartedness and generosity and spirit. You know, for a boy growing up in New York City, seeing animals on the street being driven in by their herders for sale, that's not something I ever saw. So being in Ireland and in Europe in general, to see the way animals were part of the ordinary daily life, particularly in Málaga, I saw often horse-drawn wagons pulling carts through the street and carrying produce or sometimes building materials. So then I went to France and learned something about the French, which is they'll do anything to get a cup of coffee and read the newspaper. You know, small moments, the timing of things that happen in lives. I mean, a funeral is in process, and just the way he reaches his hand to shake and the woman kissing another woman in the background, these little fragments of timing are what photography is made of. It's not about putting something in the center always and shooting an arrow into it. It's about the rich distribution of interesting, ordinary life all coming together in a frame. sometimes one observes the simple joys of life. A kid balancing a baguette on his finger, or someone carrying those wine bottles pressed in. And you think how joyous ordinary life is. And then sometimes things just set themselves up beautifully. I mean, to have that row of young women with their legs like that, and then to see the balcony work above, to me it was like a harmony in some way. I like that. The only three-armed cinematographer in France. You know what was really strange to me? I came upon this scene just at this minute where the man was stepping over the fallen man with a hammer in his hand. I arrived, I made one photograph, and it was over. But no one in Paris came over to help that young man. And I thought, you know, what's going on? Where is the human connection? One of yours has fallen, maybe had a stroke or you know, an epileptic fit, but not a person went over to him. It seemed so strange to me, and it gave me a sense of what urban life can do and how it can squeeze the compassion out of you. And then moments of tenderness, you know. I used to say, and I won't say it anymore, you should see the back of his head. Forget about it. Some more of the pears. This is in the Orangerie in Paris. I just walked into the room, and there, in the window, is sort of a reenactment of the painting next to it. And I thought, you know, this is that classic life imitates art. And so I was able to make two pictures of this thing. And who prefers the orange one most? Okay, and how many people prefer the black and white one? Oh, it's uguale, quasi uguale. Okay, well, you see, that's what's so great about making that. And here I am entering Spain. And again, this is photographed from a car while I'm driving, as is this. And yeah. So, to continue where I left off about Pablo and Málaga and the Escalones, 3 countries ago, when we arrived in Málaga and I went to Barcarola, I found Pablo, and he said, come with me to the Escalona house. Pablo is in the middle there. This is Pedro Escalona, who became a famous guitarist. Antonio, the father, who was the maestro. And Anna, who I think is here in the audience. Anna, are you? Okay. Anna. So here we were, 2 young Americans taken by Pablo into this family of gypsy, passionate gypsy flamenco players and singers. And after a little dinner, they started to make music. And I remembered that while I was in England, a friend of mine on a US Air Force base said to me, you ought to buy this tape recorder. It's a German tape recorder, and the BBC uses it to record on location. I said, what do I need a tape recorder for? I have cameras. And he said, buy this tape recorder. It's so good. You never know. When they started to play, I remembered, I've got a tape recorder in the car. I ran out. I brought the tape recorder in. I hung the mic, as you could see, from the one lamp in the living room. And I made a recording of what they were playing. And then I played it back to them. And the Escalonas had never heard themselves recorded. So this was a first for them. And that recording was like the key that opened up their hearts to these two American kids. And they said, come, you come anytime you want, come. And for the next 6 months, we probably ate every dinner at the Escalona's house and made music. And Vivian, my wife at the time, became his star pupil. He called her La Dimona, La Prodige, because she picked it up with a kind of ease that was unusual for students who had studied with him. So this was our passport in, and really to be an American visitor and to not be just on the touristic surface of Málaga, but to be inside a family, inside a barrio that had unpaved streets. It was a whole other world, and it was a world that was so generous and loving and filled with the spirit, the duende of flamenco. This man here, Manolillo was his name, he was a railroad worker, most of the time wearing a leather apron and pushing barrels around. But he was an aficionado who was respected by everyone in Málaga. And so here he is telling the famous singer, Manuel Avila, he's telling him how somebody did it 30 years before. And he's even though his voice isn't a trained voice, he knows the inflection and the tones and the flavor. And he's telling it to him. And I thought, wow, I am living in an art form, Antonio. I am living inside an art form that depends upon momentary revelations. And what is photography but momentary revelations? Things that happen and disappear within the breath of a second. So flamenco taught me something special. Do you know where this is? This is still right on Plaza Constitución, in a doorway. It's amazing that just the way people are passing by each other might be interesting enough to make a photograph. Sometimes there's drama, and sometimes there's no drama, but it has dramatic potential. You know, it's a hard thing to describe the poetic potential of photography. I mean, in a moment like this, it's nothing. People are just moving around, and mostly men. And then this woman with that incredible kerchief, no face, it's just a mark, passes through them, and my senses light up, and I think, ooh, this. And yet, what is it? I couldn't explain it. If someone said, what did you make a photograph of? I would say, a crowd of guys and a woman in a red scarf. It wouldn't mean anything. But somehow it meant something to me. And one of the things that really transformed me in Málaga was that I started to move away from a single object in the center of the frame, and I began to try to make pictures that were more complicated, that had layers in them, so that you, the viewer, would do the work. You'd have to start taking in everything as if it was life. I think photography is a record, that every photographer makes of what it is in life that is important to them. And it's an offering to the viewer is to say, I think this is worth looking at. You know, it feels like it's got some special quality to me. We passed by this yesterday, and it's all fixed up now. It's paved, there's trees, there's a little park. Really changed for the better. This is one of the photographs that Miguel and I first bonded on. You know, like, why? Something about a pool by the sea, something that is tame and something that is wild. There's a charge there. I love this picture because in the little circus, when the girls were going to do their acrobatic thing, the circus master, the ringmaster, said, imagine that they are 30 meters up. Imagine. I mean, they're like 3 meters up, but he's pretending, and the whole audience said, ooh, 30 meters. I loved it. It was theater. Semana Santa was a big shock to me, but it was also very powerful and beautiful and mysterious, and to see the tradition constantly reenacted every spring, it was amazing. And I spent days and nights out photographing all of the efforts of everybody. All those guys who had done bad things, and as penitence, they had to carry that altar around. For some reason, this is in the cathedral. And remember, when I was living here, it was still in the time of Franco, so there was a lot of pressure on the people of Málaga. You had to behave yourself. And here was a woman with a miniskirt in Málaga. It wasn't actually something that was everywhere in Málaga. Málaga had a different, more conservative character to it. And I thought to myself, this is the future. You know, a woman in a miniskirt is going to change things over time. And it's happened. This is inside the Escalona house in Barrio 26 de Febrero. And it was joyous. I mean, every time, no matter how difficult or demanding things were, it was always joyous. And if things were tough, Antonio, the father, would say, well, if it's tough, I'll put another hole in my belt and I'll just pull it tighter. And I thought, what a philosophy, what a way to live, you know, in precarious times. In May of that year, we left and we made a kind of flying trip across Germany and Austria into the communist countries and Yugoslavia, traveling down to Turkey, where I toured almost all of Turkey. Perhaps you can begin to see that periodically there are pictures that are dispersed all over the frame, which was an effort on my part to change my way of photographing from something that was centered to something that was all over. It became a long process for me. You know, one doesn't just arrive at some place easily. It's a struggle. You have to give something up that you know how to do well. You have to be willing to give it up so that you can stumble along and become the next version of yourself, that the challenges that are posed by the subjects you choose are going to push you to recognizing a new version of yourself. I knew I was in the communist countries when I arrived at the border to Bulgaria, and while I was waiting there, I heard a huge bang, and the R in Bulgaria fell off the building onto the road. And the little customs guy came out and picked it up and ran across the road. And I thought, yeah, the communist countries are falling apart. Proof. Nothing. Who likes the color better than the black and white? And who likes the black and white? Oh, things are changing. Or maybe it's just the picture. I want to say something about this picture because it's one of those photographs that has penetrated whatever surface I have. It's like it touches my heart. For me, the point of the picture that is so beautiful is the way the boy has locked his knees like that, so that he could pour this water on this half a man. He could pour the water in a thin stream and not splash water on his suit. The little boy had a sense of dignity that this man deserved. He was honoring him. And it all seemed to me to be just in the way he braced himself so that the water was a fine stream. And it's tender moments like that that are really nearly invisible to everybody that a photographer often sees and realizes, that's the essence of the picture. Everything else comes along, but at the heart of it, something is the key that opens it up. This is also made from the moving car, and Miguel and I felt this was a really an iconic picture to have in the exhibition because it's about traveling. And I was in the passenger seat, my wife then was driving, and I remember as they pulled up alongside me on a very tiny road in Greece, I could hear her scarf like that, and I thought, oh, it's so beautiful. So sometimes it's sound or smells or light and time. Of course, it's always time. You know that every photograph that you look at is now. At that moment that it was made, it was now. This is happening now. It lasts for 1,000th of a second, and it's gone. And so I think all photographers love the aspect of photography that is saying the present moment is everything. That's all we have at any given time is the present, now. What time is it? Ora. Greece. I had a moment to just lay in the sun for a few weeks. And from Greece, we took a boat to Italy and over to Naples, got on board the Michelangelo, and 1 year to the week, we sailed back to New York City. And this guy, probably saying goodbye to Naples. And suddenly I was back in the absurdity of America, the Vietnam War, protests, shipbuilding for the war effort, people riding around in New York with protest symbols on their bikes, anti-war demonstrations. It was a whole new experience for me. And I think that my time in Europe and in Málaga opened me up in a way that I could see America freshly. I could see the absurdity of life in America and the stress of it and the crazy humor of it. I think I'm also touched by surrealism early on, because there were things that, maybe it's America, but things that always seem so surreal to me. I love this picture. But this, when I said before that you have to give things up, I realized I was at a point in my life where catching something, like a little story in the frame, was the thing I wanted to give up. Because I wanted to make color prints that were really big. And to do that, I needed all the space in front of the camera. And in order to do that, I had to move back and give up the action or the incident that was the hook in the frame. So I started making pictures in which I tried to empty the middle and have things happen all over the frame and hope that they would be interesting enough to hold my attention. The complexity of layers and levels. I mean, we don't talk about cubism in photography because it was impossible to replicate that kind of fracture and fragmentation. But modern life in cities today is about fragmentation. It is about fracture. It's about many things happening at the same time. So I was trying to find my way into accepting that and finding a visual form for that, in which chaos and all of the powers of description that a camera and film can give you might actually allow me to make prints of this scale that people could enter, could almost feel as if they're walking on the street with the subjects in the photograph. But I was running into a confrontation, and that was I wanted the detail and description that was on the film to be sharp enough to go up really big. And a 35mm camera at that time couldn't quite do it. So at a certain moment, I switched to a 20 by 25 centimeter wooden camera that you put a piece of film in this big, like that. And I started making, this is 1976, I started making work that was slow and steady and clear. I had to put a hood on over my head. I had to look at a big screen in the back. It wasn't just a little camera passing in front of my face. And it was as if I was learning a new language or a new vocabulary for what makes a photograph. And part of that was time. When I work with a Leica, a small camera, time is 250th of a second or 1,000th of a second. When I work with this camera, time is 3 seconds, 4 seconds. It's a whole other human dimension. And it comes with advantages. It draws in all of the descriptive power of the lens. And suddenly things make sense in a very different way. And I found that my subject matter changed and my ideas about photography changed. And it was a revelation at 40 years of age to try something completely new, to give up the thing that I knew best and step into an unknown aspect of photography. And I made a whole series of pictures here in which there was hardly any differentiation between the sky and the water, just the horizon line. I lived on the water in Cape Cod Massachusetts, near Boston. And so I had a chance to observe 1,000 evenings and photograph them. I'm only going to show you 2 or 3, but they were as delicate or as powerful or as mysterious as the weather is. And you know, I actually felt connected to some of my earlier times when I was a painter and I was doing large field paintings. In that first summer that I worked with a large camera, I made 2 portraits in that summer, and both of them were pinned on the wall over my desk in New York for a whole year. And at the end of that year, I realized, must be speaking to me. So next summer, I'm going to make portraits, because I had never really made portraits before. On the street, portraits are just people in motion. But these required stopping somebody and looking carefully at them and taking the time to describe them and to try to find the truth, some essential truth to any person who sits for their portrait. I did a whole series of odalisques. What's the time? Great. Okay. You know, to go over to a stranger on the street and say, I need to make a photograph of you. I need to make a photograph of you. And to then get them to give themselves to a total stranger and to be willing to stand in front of this camera and perhaps reveal something of their secret, their identity, their character, their persona, their very being. And it's risky, because it doesn't always work. Not everybody gives. But it's an effort to try to make that connection and to learn from it. And I've made over 1,000 pictures with that big wooden camera, just of people. Even this young dancer near the World Trade Center. So for many years, I had a studio in Manhattan that looked south with an unobstructed view of the World Trade Center. And I made many photographs out that window as weather and storms, seasons changed. And in September of 2001, I was planning to have a show at a gallery in Soho, New York. And the show was called Looking South. And it was about the World Trade Center and the landscape behind it. And then, of course, 9/11 happened. And so I volunteered to go inside Ground Zero. And I spent most of 9 months inside photographing the restoration, the cleaning up, the search for bodies. I made 8,500 photographs inside Ground Zero, and they form part of an archive in New York. I mean, look at the scale of the beams. It was amazingly dangerous to be in there. In this moment, all of these firemen are waiting because someone crawled in to the debris and found 5 firemen's bodies, intact in their fireman's gear, but in a stairwell where they were killed when the building fell. And I was privileged to be right there with them. I remember this was one of those fall days where the air is cool and the sun is still strong, and I was standing there feeling the heat of it on my back and thinking, wow, this is so beautiful. Even though it was inside Ground Zero, it was beautiful. And I thought, oh, maybe I shouldn't have that feeling. I'm alive. There's 3,000 people who died in here. This is a cemetery. And I remember being on the fence. Should I make the picture? Should I not make the picture? And I thought, no, I'm here to make the record. Because what this picture told me at that moment was that time heals everything. A sunny day, a month has passed, the years will pass, this memory will go further and further into the distance in the past, and that this is a moment of hope, that this picture is a sense of, for me, that rebuilding will happen, rejuvenation will happen, life will continue. And I think that color brought some of that optimism to the work inside Ground Zero. This is after all the debris was cleared away. They were down at the bedrock of Manhattan. And there were men all day long sifting through the debris and the dirt, looking for a bone or a tooth or something that would have the DNA that might identify somebody. And I remember standing there and thinking, how humble it is just to look at dirt. No big subject, dirt. And I thought, what would it be like to try to photograph the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, water, only as a field, only as just the thing itself, not make a photograph that has some kind of design to it, but is just the thing. Would people be able to look at it and take something from it, or would it be just dumb? It's still a toss-up. So this is air, water, fire. And there are more in the series, but 4 demonstrations is enough. For the last 12 or 13 years, we've been living in Europe, and we spent 10 of them in Italy. And somehow, whatever it was, the house that we rented, the skylight, something, I began to see objects in a different way. And I wanted to make still lives. And then on a visit to Bologna, Italy, I heard that Morandi's studio was open to visitors. And I went to the studio, and I saw his objects. And I asked the curators there, could I come to the studio and photograph all of Morandi's objects? He had very interesting found objects that he took out of the trash to bring it home again and bring life to it. And they said, yeah, help yourself. So I photographed 360 of Morandi's objects on the table that he painted on. All those circles, all that graffiti you see there is how he drew around the objects he put. He wanted to remember where they were. And then on a visit to Aix-en-Provence, I went to Cézanne's studio, and the same thing came over me. Why did he paint his walls gray? What was it about gray and objects? And so I spent a few days photographing there too. And then I started making a few pictures of my own, of things that I found in France or in Italy, strange objects that had character. And in a way, I felt that I could rearrange them, not like still lifes in a traditional way, but in like the street. I wanted to see if I could find images that felt like people looking at things and doing things and walking together. And this is my self-portrait. I love this picture. And it's the end. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you to everybody. Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Maggie. Thank you, Escalones. Thank you. Thank you. Are we on time?